Hello, thank you for coming today to today's event on how did or did not Japan respond to Taiwan Strait crisis and afterwards. My name is Carl Levan. I'm an associate professor here in the School of International Service at American University, and I'm a newcomer to all things Japan. And after spending last semester in Kyoto at Ritsumeikan University, I include myself among one of its passionate new fans and followers. And so I'm grateful to the US-Japan Institute for organizing this event in collaboration with the School of International Service and Ritsumeikan University, and I thank Lou Goodman for reaching out to me to ask me to play a role on this new area of interest to me, and I'm very happy that I'll be able to learn from several experts who are long collaborators and voices in this scholarship in this area. Next week, the US-Japan Institute will be hosting an event called The Challenges of UN on Peacebuilding, Roles of US and Japan, where they will explore collaboration on peace building in places as difficult as Syria, South Sudan, and beyond. And the Japan Institute is located on M Street here in Washington, D.C. And we're going to first hear from Professor Keiji Nakatsuji, who's an operating advisor at the US-Japan Institute and a professor at Ritsumeikan University. And he's an expert on China's trade relations, including its campaign to join the World Trade Organization. And today, he's going to talk about US-Japan relations and also Japan-Taiwan relations. After him, we'll hear from Professor Robert Ross of Boston College, who's a co-editor most recently of a book called Strategic Adjustment and the Rise of China, Power and Politics in East Asia. He's a prolific author and also a frequent expert witness before Congress, the United States Congress, on matters relating to foreign policy towards Asia and the international relations of East Asia. We also have two excellent informed discussants today. My colleague here in the School of International Service, Professor Philip Brenner, who's a scholar of international relations and a giant of scholarship on the Cold War, and also Sachio Nakato, who is an operating advisor to the US-Japan Institute and also a professor at Ritsumeikan University, who will share some comments in reaction to the two presentations. He's an expert on North Korea and issues pertaining to unification, including how those issues relate to Japan's foreign policy. And so I don't want to be too bold in framing any of the issues that will follow in the discussion, but I did want to perhaps suggest why I became interested in participating in this event and learning more about this urgently important part of the world. Right now, China is pushing for a renewed unification as part of a rhetoric around a one China policy. And the recent election of Taiwan's new president brought in the DPP, controlling the legislative and executive branches for the first time. And this is a party that is historically more friendly towards a Taiwanese independence policy. And this has been somewhat troubling for China, also because polls supporting independence have been growing in Taiwan. This is a relatively recent development historically. And also the president of Taiwan called for the containment of China's expansion and what she called hegemonic influence last year, about a year ago. And these comments caused ripple effects, I think, in the Pacific relations. It's also coming at a time where the United States has recently announced the scaling down of annual military exercises in Korea, and President Trump stumbled in his relations over the nuclear disarmament talks with North Korea. And he did this at a time when the United States for the first time since the end of the Cold War, last year in its nuclear posture review called for a renewed emphasis on U.S. nuclear weapons and a new generation of development. And so the grand politics of security of the region, as well as some of the domestic politics and the shifting regional alliances, are very much in flux. And so one of the things we're looking forward to learning about today is Japan's perspective and what perhaps the United States needs to know in order to deeply appreciate and continue to grow and to solidify U.S.-Japan relations and to keep the region conflict-free and moving into the next generation of geopolitical stability and hopefully economic development. And so, again, we'll start with some comments from Professor Keiji Nakatsuji, very briefly, who's going to describe some of the institutional relationships that I've mentioned, and then we'll hear from Robert Ross, and then we'll return to Professor Nakatsuji for his longer presentation on the substance of the questions at hand. Thank you.
I'm sure that some of you are already frequent participants to USJI symposium workshop. But let me briefly explain about USJI as well as AU-RU relations. Today's event is sort of double joint endeavor. AU, American University, and Ritsumeikan University in Kyoto has been very close partner over a quarter century. We have dual master degree programs. We have dual undergraduate degree programs. We started a few years ago joint degree program as well. So even at faculty level, we know each other quite well, and both faculties are troubling each other very, very much. So I would like to thank American University first allowing us to use this wonderful conference room as a venue of this symposium. And of course, our biggest contribution on the part of AU as far as today's event is we are having two wonderful professors from American University, Phil and Carr. And a little about USJI. AU-RU relations are rather one university to one university relations. But 8 major universities in Japan started what we call US-Japan Research Institute. It's a consortium. Actually, we have an office at Washington, D.C., as Carl has explained a little while ago. We constantly provide workshops and symposiums. And this is a part of what we call US-Japan Week. And reason is quite simple, that we would like to strengthen second track, non-governmental relationship between Americans and Japanese. And United States and Japan are really quite big, and we have to be partially responsible for global governance and peace and economic prosperity. So former president of Waseda University, Professor Shirai, proposed to establish USJI, and we have been actively working on that idea last 10 years. And please refer to our website and learn what kind of events we are providing. And now we should start the symposium part. Thank you.
Okay. So thank you for those comments. And if you like, you can certainly take the microphone up if you prefer. Next, we'll hear from Robert Ross from Boston College. Would you like the microphone?
Use microphone.
this. Is this mic picking this up? Is it? No.
There's a hand up. That's microphone.
You can't. You'll hear. I'll talk. You'll hear. So first, I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to Katie Napasucci for all his help in getting me here. We've had many emails back and forth, and I appreciate the invitation. And I appreciate an invitation from USJI. This is the first time I've participated in a USJI event, and participate in USJI Week in Washington is particularly an opportunity. And again, following up on KG's remarks, thank you to AU for allowing me to participate. The question I was asked was, what should Japan do if there is a U.S.-China war over Taiwan? And I have to admit, I found that to be a rather awkward subject, because it's sort of a very dark subject out there, right? And we're going to fight a war over Taiwan. But I dutifully prepared my talk. First time I've done this, so I had to think about it. And since I did that, the more I think about it, the more I thought this is a question that's being asked all around these days. As we're seeing the rise of China, and for someone like me, whenever there's a rising power, there's always a declining power. So we're watching the rise of China and the decline of the United States. Every country these days is wondering what to do in this geopolitical struggle between the great powers. So recently you may have read that the defense minister of the Philippines commented that he wanted to revise the U.S.-Philippine treaty because it was such an ironclad treaty, it would drag the Philippines into a conflict between China and the United States, and they may want to stay out of that conflict. Well, the United States, your reaction is, thanks a lot, you're not much of an ally. Today I read the Prime Minister of Malaysia said, well, in this geopolitical struggle, we're going to lean toward China. They're close to us. They've been part of our history. They've got more aid. And, America, they've been rather unreliable recently. Our president has a way of doing that. South Korea, we're seeing them try to chart their own path toward North Korea. And the 3 no's that South Korea reached with China was, I would argue, the first time that South Korea has ever reached an agreement with China to limit South Korean cooperation with the United States. I think that was a very important signal of South Korea adjusting to the rise of China. And today I met with the representative of Taiwan to Washington who said Taiwan's at the front line of dealing with this issue, and it too has to walk a tightrope. So the question I've been asked to talk about regarding Japan is in many senses not unique, but a question that's being asked all around East Asia. Well, let me begin by looking at the Taiwan Strait and say, is there going to be a war? We'll start with that one. And I would suggest to you a war in Taiwan, or in the Taiwan Strait, is highly unlikely. I think since about the year 2000, the whole concept and notion of independence has simply been one that's too dangerous for the people on Taiwan. So you may see in the polls that support for independence is growing, but those who say support for independence today, well, that's about 6%. And everyone else is basically the status quo. Maybe independence in the future, maybe unification in the future, we'll wait and see in the future, but no one wants to rock the status quo. The mainland missiles will get through, missile defense doesn't work. Trade dependence, mainland simply has to close the ports on the mainland and the Taiwan economy dies. There's nothing the United States can do to defend Taiwan from the cost of war, no matter who wins that war. This is clear not only in the balance in 2000, but also when the Lian Jian, the head of the KMT back in 2005, made a surprise visit, or I should say a controversial visit to Beijing. He had tea with the leaders of China, came back to Taiwan to a 61% approval rate. That was eye-opening for the island, eye-opening for the KMT. Oh, the people are nervous about Chen Shui-bian. They want better relations across the strait. After all, Ma Ying-jeou won the election, and he said in his heart he wanted unification. And he said there was one China, Taiwan belonged to China. Didn't say the PRC, but he said China. And of course now, President Tsai in all her campaigns never mentions the I word. She never mentions it. So this has been clear that Taiwan knows a declaration of independence is not something they will do, and we all associate that as an act of war. But war is also far too costly, will remain far too costly for China for the foreseeable future, well into the foreseeable future. And what if Taiwan resists? What if it's a difficult landing that made Normandy look easy? Anyone who's traveled around Taiwan knows that the terrain looks an awful lot like Yugoslavia. And the partisans in Yugoslavia gave the Germans a real hard time. You don't want to fight a guerrilla war on Taiwan. And we know civil wars are the most costliest wars in history. Who knows how the Taiwan people will react if the mainland decides to forcefully unify? And of course, if it's a long war, you don't want to be the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party, the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, when you were unable to defeat this small island of 23 million people within a few weeks. That's a surefire way to lose legitimacy for the Chinese Communist Party. And finally, this could be a costly war. Taiwan's been investing in missiles. What kind of missiles? Anti-air missiles, anti-ship missiles. Oh, you really want to lose that big, strong Navy and Air Force you've been building? Why have you been building it? To deal with the American Navy, not to deal with Taiwan. A long, costly war from the mainland against Taiwan would severely weaken the Chinese and the U.S.-China military balance after they spent the last 40 years promoting the rise of China. And of course, the U.S. doesn't want this war. The United States, we should underscore, has no material strategic interest in Taiwan whatsoever. The United States decided a long time ago that 90 miles from Taiwan made it a very unreliable place to deploy troops, our Navy, our Air Force. Thank you very much. American interest in Taiwan is very clear. We said we defended for the last 70 years. Well, we better damn well defend it, or others may begin to question our commitments, although our president may be doing that well enough on his own. But yes, since the Korean War, the issue for the United States is not who wins the Chinese Civil War, but how it's resolved. It has to be peacefully, because it is by force it challenges American commitments. But if the people in Taiwan want to run around with the little red book of Chairman Xi Jinping, you go right ahead, as long as it's peaceful. Because America has never had a material interest in the island of Taiwan. Now, there could be an unintended incident in the Taiwan Strait that escalates. There's an old Chinese expression, a single spark can light a prairie fire. But if that was so, we should understand the war wouldn't be over Taiwan. The war would be over the balance of power in East Asia. It would be over the power transition. It would be over a preventive American war to prevent the Chinese from rising. Or Chinese trying to establish the resolve as a rising power in a power transition. But that could happen in the South China Sea over the Spratly Islands. That could happen in the South China Sea over an incident at sea between our ships. That's what I worry about. An unintended incident anywhere where our two countries' resolve is so tied in that each side finds it difficult to back down. Now, even if there's a Taiwan Declaration of Independence, I still think we'd likely avoid war. We have this image of Taiwan declares independence, bang, there's war the next day. No, countries don't go to war the next day. Yes, it would challenge the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Yes, it would challenge the rising power status and their credibility, but not an immediate outbreak of war. War takes time to occur. Countries need to mobilize their forces to get ready for war. Countries choose the timing by weather, by politics. When's the best time to attack? You have to allow time for your pressure and your threats and your coercion to work. So it wouldn't be automatic. And as they're waiting for war to happen, what would be happening in between? The United States and China would be cooperating to roll back Taiwan's Declaration of Independence, and you would see massive intervention by the United States and Taiwan in domestic politics. After all, we made it very clear to the people in Taiwan that we opposed Chen Shui-bian when he was president of Taiwan, and that would be nothing compared to what we would do if Taiwan declared independence. So I even think it could be rolled back. With some little political instability, you may find Taiwan having a new leader, rather than one who dared to destabilize the Taiwan Strait with the Declaration of Independence. Nonetheless, we need to consider the question at hand. A U.S.-China war over Taiwan could happen, regardless of the cause. And if there was Chinese use of force against Taiwan, regardless of the reason, it could force the American hand. American issues of credibility, alliance commitments that forced the Americans to intervene. The rise of China, reputational issues of the United States as a declining power, as a great power, and again, alliance commitments. A preventive war, maybe those in the U.S. Navy, who may want to use this as an opportunity. After all, if you watch the U.S. Navy in the last 5 to 10 years, they're not happy with the rise of the Chinese Navy. Then it could be a big war. The naval losses could be quite consequential. The outcome would affect the regional balance of power. So both sides may be willing to commit a large amount of resources. And nuclear weapons would not necessarily constrain the escalation of conventional war at sea, unlike the way nuclear weapons constrain even the outbreak of war on land in Europe during the Cold War. Now, if this were the case, if war did happen at sea, the United States would be dependent on its allies for power projection into East Asia. Guam is not big enough to host a larger U.S. Navy contingency going back and forth during wartime. Hawaii is too far away. After all, that is the foundation of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Without the U.S.-Japan alliance, the United States cannot be an East Asian power. And this is why Americans frequently have said since the end of the Cold War, the U.S.-Japan alliance is the most important U.S. alliance in the world. And that's true. Because since the end of the Cold War, the major theater for American security has been East Asia, and the major American ally in East Asia has been Japan. And so Japan is a major force, a major presence for the United States to project power and wage war in East Asia. Guam is not big enough. It doesn't have the ship berths, no carrier berths. We need major hospitals in wartime. You need major supplies, spare parts, food, water, etc. Well, if this were to happen, the question I was asked, what should Japan do? And again, this is the question the Philippines is asking, Malaysia is asking, Korea is asking, everyone's asking that question. Well, what are Japan's immediate security interests in a cross-strait conflict? Well, let's be clear, Japan has no material interest in the island of Taiwan. Taiwan is not intrinsically important. So if you push the Japanese, who are hawks on this issue, they will tell you the east coast of Japan is a perfect place should China occupy east coast of Taiwan. It's a perfect place for should China occupy Taiwan to use it as a submarine base. Because the continental shelf drops off so fast that Chinese submarines could leave the ports on the east coast of Taiwan, drop into the deep waters, and be difficult to conduct ASW. That's all true. But that's not a sufficient reason to fight a war. And Japan, unlike the United States, has no credibility interest entailed in the outcome of a mainland Taiwan war. Japan's defense priority today is clear. It's the East China Sea, not Taiwan. Back in the 1980s, we discussed Japan's responsibility for sea lane control for 1,000 nautical miles south of Japan. No one talks about that today. They talk about today Japan's preoccupation with the rise of the Chinese Navy in the East China Sea. In the revised guidelines of 1996, we spoke about Japan's participation in Taiwan contingency. We don't talk about that today. It's hard to imagine that Japan, given its military capabilities compared to China, and given its preoccupation with the East China Sea, Japan would directly participate in cross-strait operations in a U.S.-China war over Taiwan. Japan has its hands full again in the East China Sea, and this is Japan's coastal waters. This matters far more to Japanese security than the Taiwan Strait. And of course, to the extent that Japan cares, at stake would be the Diaoyu Islands and Hakko Island. Moreover, we have to consider Chinese strategic trends and acknowledge that the balance of power is gradually but surely tipping in China's favor. The size of the fleet, the Chinese fleet is now much larger than the United States fleet by, 80 ships. That makes it a lot larger than the Japanese fleet. Quantity does matter in naval affairs. Having said that, the technological gap between Japan and China is narrowing over time. China is developing every kind of new technology imaginable. China's GDP is growing 6 times faster than Japan's GDP. And China's defense budget is growing 6 times faster than Japan's defense budget. The These are trends that have been going on for the last 20 years. And all of this would be taken into account how Japan responds to a crisis in the war in the Taiwan Strait, and to focus on the Sea of Japan, the East China Sea. To participate in the cross-strait war would have exposed Japanese security interests in the East China Sea. Japan also lacks standoff aircraft that would allow it to project power down to Taiwan. It lacks sufficient aircraft carrier capability to allow it to project air capabilities down to the Taiwan Strait. Japan's capabilities are essentially limited to the East China Sea, and that's where Japanese interests are. Having said that, that doesn't excuse the question for Japan of what Japan would do in a war. Cooperation with the United States would still be an issue Japan would have to face. The issue would be to allow U.S. access to Japanese bases to conduct operations in Taiwan Strait. There are three things Japan could do with such a war. One, to give U.S. access to its facilities, so the United States can get spare parts, water, food, docking facilities. Second, to defend the home islands against China, should it escalate, so the United States can get access to airports, air facilities, and naval facilities in Japan. And third, to assist the United States in conduct anti-submarine warfare in the Western Pacific, which Japan is very good at. But there are risks that Japan would think about in making this decision. Would China target Japanese territory? Well, every country in Southeast Asia assumes that the United States started using their territory in a South China Sea conflict, China would target their bases. Subic Bay would be a target. Changi and Singapore would be a target. Port Klang would be a target. Japan would have to ask, would Japanese bases be targeting Chinese missiles? Now, it's a lot easier for China to target the Philippines than to target Japan, because the Philippines can't retaliate. Nonetheless, this is a cost that Japan would pay were it to participate in a U.S.-China war by giving the United States cooperation. Chinese missiles are accurate, and there's no defense. Moreover, the cost of Japan would be greater than the cost of China, simply because China is a much bigger country, so the damage overall would be less. China is a much larger economy, so the economic impact would be less. That contributes to Chinese resolve to do this more than Japanese resolve, insofar as the costs are asymmetric. Second, should Japan participate, the war would likely escalate to the East China Sea. What would the outcome be in the East China Sea? Does Japan want to risk a war in the East China Sea that it may or may not win? The outcome would be unclear. So we have major security interests for Japan, engagement as this country becomes a target of Chinese missiles, and an escalation of the war to a vital Japanese security interest, the East China Sea. But there are risks for Japan if it does not participate. If Japan were to remain aloof, that would be the end of the U.S.-Japan alliance. Americans would be dying in the Taiwan Strait or in the Western Pacific, and Japan would stay on the sidelines and not help its ally fight the war. The alliance could not survive that kind of political crisis. It would be the end of the U.S. strategic interest in the alliance, because the purpose of the alliance is to help the Americans to wage war. One purpose. It would be the political end of the alliance because the American people and the American Congress would not tolerate an alliance with a country that wouldn't go to war with the United States. Another risk is that should China win, there would be a greater risk, greater threat from China toward Japan than currently would exist. Because China would have defeated the United States, would have sent a signal throughout the region that American alliances are no longer useful, and that China would now present a threat to Japan without the alliance as a backstop to Japan. Greater threat to the Sea of Japan, the East China Sea, and a greater threat to the Senkaku Island. In these circumstances, Japan might well be compelled to develop nuclear weapons. The alliance is no longer valuable, and the Chinese are stronger than they were before. But there are benefits of participating. You sustain the alliance. You would have victory in a war that would set back the rise of China considerably. not a small interest for Japan or the United States. And it would restore considerable Japanese security in this coastal war. The Chinese Navy and Air Force would be severely degraded with a corresponding relative rise of Japanese capability. Equally important would be the context, the geopolitical context in which Japan would make this decision. What is the trend in the power transition between China and the United States? Is there confidence in U.S. resolve and its capabilities? Or is there a recognition that U.S. resolve and capabilities have sufficiently declined so the alliance is no longer valuable to Japan anyway? This is a question the Philippines is asking, Malaysia is asking, South Korea is asking. They're all asking this question. Is the alliance still valuable when the power gap between China and the United States is closed so well and so quickly? If indeed Japan were to reach that conclusion, then there's no point in going to war to protect the alliance. The Americans are no longer a reliable alliance partner. And of course, the Japanese will have to ask who will win the war, regardless of whether they participate. So what should Japan do? Far be it for me to answer that question. I will never tell Japanese people what they should do. I can only say that there are very many, very strategically important factors that will weigh in this decision, with considerable uncertainty now, and there will be considerable uncertainty at the height of the crisis. I can only tell you that for Japan, there will be a lot at stake in the decision they make. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ross from Boston College. Next, we'll hear from Professor Keiji Nakatsuji from Ritsumeikan University, who will talk a little bit about the Japan-U.S. relationship and also Japan-Taiwan relations. He'll speak for about 25 minutes, and I'll get a little irritating around 20 minutes or so.
Thank you, Carl. I'm a historian, so I will rather trace back history in an orthodox way, starting from mid-1990s. Before starting my talk, I agree to Professor Ross. War over Taiwan is not likely, unlikely, it is unlikely. If we consider the issue in a very rational, objective manner. And another keyword which he used, and not only he, but many scholars talking about Taiwan use, is everybody is status quo oriented. But it's not true. Taiwan is not hoping to have a war with China, obviously, so they can declare independence. And that means that they're not very happy with the status quo. China doesn't seem to be realizing unification with Taiwan. So China would like to avoid war with the United States. So they have to put up with status quo, but they're not happy. That's where the game starts. Okay. Rational calculation cannot determine everything. So more emotional, more subjective hope sometimes bring the dangerous situation. Having said that, let me start my talk. I don't know, we have very interesting audience. And I'm not quite sure how I should talk to you, because it appears that some of you are very young undergraduate students, some of you are very well-trained smart. So, with what level I should talk about? I'm pretty much confused yet. Maybe I should start a little about very much introductory part. I guess you all know all 6 guys. The one in the middle, you know Clinton, no problem. John Zemin. The one in the middle is Lee Teng-hui, president. I have to talk 3 things about his background. He graduated from Kyoto University for his undergraduate education. So he studied in Japan. Then he's a scholar, agricultural economist. He took PhD from Cornell University. Another important point with him is that he is first nationalist, Kuomintang president, who was born in Taiwan, not in mainland. And our current Prime Minister Abe, seems to be exceeding his tenure with any prime ministers in history of Japan. It has been almost customary that we change prime minister every year. And if we are talking about late 90s, we have to talk with three prime ministers. Prime Minister Murayama from Japan Socialist Party, and the second one is Hashimoto. Third one is Ochi. Both are from long-time ruling Liberal Democratic Party. And very peculiar situation that we had during that mid-50s is Japan Socialist Party and Liberal Democratic Party, they made coalition. They have been opponents to each other throughout the Cold War. And what we went across, we actually was kind of Cold War at home. So they opposed each other very much, but during mid-50s, they had a marriage of convenience, but they had hard time to harmonize, coordinate their foreign policy, especially over Taiwan. I think I shouldn't talk too much about timeline of 1995-6 Taiwan Strait crisis, mostly because Professor Ross partially touched upon it already. But a couple of things. Pragmatic diplomacy. President Lee Teng-hui obviously wanted to enhance Taiwan as a political entity. And he wanted to return back to UN. Taiwan was also when China entered United Nations. And Taiwan even, Lee Teng-hui even placed that Taiwan is ready to contribute US $1 billion for economic cooperation. And at that moment, Taiwan had the biggest foreign US dollar reserve in the world, more than Japan actually. And the problem started with Lee's trip to Cornell University, his alma mater. China didn't like Clinton issued a visa to him. And they consider that it is breaching America's pledge of one China policy, maintaining one China policy. So after that, China started a series of missile shooting and military exercises around Taiwan Strait area. And most important thing is last one. Starting early March, the missile shooting and live ammunition exercise were conducted by China to influence Taiwan's first presidential election. China doubted that the therefore is aiming for independence. So to prevent these possible declaration of independence, China wanted to weaken the power of the therefore through influencing presidential election. But Lee was elected, actually. So throughout this crisis, let me recall what Japan did and did not do concerning Taiwan. Hashimoto conveyed Lee Therefore that Lipa was Prime Minister of China at that time, that Japan would not change non-governmental business relations with Taiwan, and hoped that China and Taiwan would resolve their issues peacefully. But situation in Japan was very much divided, actually. Opinions in Japan was pretty much divided. Even talking about MOFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, some foreign ministry officials said that Japan had no choice, but if the United States asked, Japan should provide logistical support, and Japan could not say. But others in the ministry, MOFA, they usually work for China Bureau. So they argued that China was different from North Korea, which didn't have diplomatic relations with Japan. So that Japan could not say yes to the US so easily. So having the crisis situation in Taiwan Strait, obviously, even Foreign Ministry of Japan was very much divided. And independence limits, I guess many of you know that those are the names of aircraft carrier of the United States. Especially Independence main port was Yokosuka. Yokosuka is a U.S. naval port nearby Tokyo. So not directly Independence was dispatched to Taiwan Strait. Independence went through Philippines to Taiwan Strait, but obviously they started from Yokosuka. But Japan did not have any clear scenario or plan what to do with a crisis that happened in, for example, Korean Peninsula or Taiwan. We already had crisis 1 year before the Taiwan Strait crisis with over DPRK, first nuclear weapon crisis. And what former administration of Japan considered was that what to do with United States if the United States decided to dispatch its military to Korean Peninsula. And not only Taiwan, but China conducted nuclear weapon testing. So, and the situation between Japan and China during mid-50s was China was growing economically. So China are getting the economic power to attract the Japanese enterprises. But at the same time that China was still undeveloped country. So Japan has been providing ODA, huge amount of ODA. So what to do with the ODA was discussed, but Japan obviously could not stop providing ODA to China. And actually Hashimoto, Prime Minister Hashimoto, examined what to do with the Taiwan Strait crisis if that actually happened, and the immediate incursion between China and Taiwan happened. Hashimoto examining to send self-defense forces transport aircraft to save Japanese in Taiwan. So for Japan, Taiwan Strait crisis was actually very real, at least for Hashimoto. And Hashimoto confessed that he couldn't sleep very well because of the crisis situation. And the United States sent former Assistant Secretary of Defense, Richard Armitage, to Japan. Clinton wanted Armitage to meet with Liberal Democratic Party, ruling party leaders, what Japan can possibly do for the United States. I don't know how much you know about the post-war foreign policy of Japan, especially security policy. Japanese constitution is usually called peace constitution. Article 9 is representing Taiwan, and you can tell that if we read literally, Japan is not supposed to have any military. But so Japan still do not use the word military, Japanese military, but we use the word self-defense forces. And of course, as far as the U.S. Military bases in Japan was concerned, about 70% of U.S. military bases are concentrated in small islands of Okinawa. We have a series of small islands. The biggest one is called Okinawa, and the U.S. military in Japan are more or less concentrated on that area. If you see the location of Okinawa, it is clear that Okinawa is pretty close to Taiwan, Korean Peninsula, of course, China, East Coast as well. So strategic importance of Okinawa was obvious, but yet there were some crimes by U.S. soldiers against civilians in Okinawa, and there was a terrible rape crime by U.S. soldiers in 1995. So Okinawa's, I think you might have read the recent news that Okinawans are opposing the moving the air base from Tenma to Hanoi. And but because of Taiwan Strait crisis, Hashimoto could not strongly demand Clinton to remove some of the bases from Okinawa. Obviously, strategic importance of Okinawa has heightened by that. So if we summarize Japan's reaction during the crisis, we can say this much. Likely that the crisis was dissipated without any military collision. But if there exists the possibility of U.S.-China collision over Taiwan in future, if Taiwan is important for the security of Japan, what should Japan do? In reality, it is a problem of how Japan should cooperate with U.S. in the framework of Japan-U.S. security treaty. In 1996, at least a portion of U.S. forces were dispatched to Taiwan area from Japan. Armitage obviously visited Japan to inquire what the support Japan could possibly provide if U.S. collided militarily with China. If U.S.-China war became intensified, there could exist a possibility of China's attack over U.S. bases in Japan. If that happens, it is the problem of territorial security of Japan. So that has not had a deep anxiety over the possibility. But it was obvious at that time that Japan did not have any contingency plan to meet such a challenge. for the entire Japan, Japanese society became a panicking situation. So after the crisis, what Japan did with the United States is the next subject that I would like to discuss briefly.
Briefly.
In 1997, new guideline between US and Japan were agreed. We had a guideline in 1978. It was mostly about the defense of Japanese territory. There wasn't much discussion about what to do with the areas surrounding Japan. That means Taiwan or Korean Peninsula. And the 1997 guideline, they used the term that situation in crisis situation in areas surrounding Japan. But they didn't mention clearly about, specifically about Korean Peninsula or Taiwan. They used the term area surrounding Japan. So it was, and the Japanese government explained that it was not geographical the concept, but situational concept. So Japan did not clarify whether Japan will assist the United States if the United States intervened in the Taiwan Strait area. And facing that, the partner of ruling coalition party, Japan Socialist Party, opposed the LPDP's opinions, and they demanded to exclude Taiwan. And cooperation with the United States should be within the limit of Japanese constitutions. And in the end, the Socialist Party decided to withdraw from coalition government. So it clearly tells that Japan do not have clear consensus about what to do with Taiwan. In 1999, the Japanese, despite guidelines, there wasn't any legal background for Japanese government to provide logistical support to the United States. So they passed the law. I used the abbreviation SIASIJ, crisis situation in area surrounding Japan. Law passed, and because of that, as I have told you, the Socialist Party withdrawn its membership with ruling party. And, of course, there were discussions in Japan that the area should be more clarified. And at that time, Prime Minister Oguchi argued that it doesn't include Middle East and the Indian Ocean. But we all know that when Iraqi war had happened, Japan sent ships to provide fuel and logistical support. So situation has been changing very much. In conclusion, what I would like to emphasize is it appears that the United States and Japan had kind of coordination. We need to investigate further to prove empirically, yet it appears they had coordination, and they adopted what I call double strategic ambiguities. The United States does not say it will defend Taiwan. If they said that Taiwan will declare independence, to prevent that, they can say, but they don't say that they don't defend Taiwan neither, and so that they can deter China. So that's a strategic ambiguity. The same thing can be said about Japan too, as I have told you that no clear spot, especially Taiwan, was mentioned in if we compare the Cold War era, that Japan only provided the checkbook diplomacy, but at the time of Gulf War, Japan contributed a huge amount of money, but still Japan was criticized. So Japan's security cooperation has been heightened this much, and what to do from now on concerning Taiwan will be continue to be very important issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nakatsuji. Next, we'll hear from two discussants who will each talk for no more than 10 minutes. I'll let you know when you've got about 2 minutes left. First, we'll hear from Professor Phil Brenner.
Thank you very much, Carl. It's very heartening to see such a large group of people here today. 30 years ago, American University had one person who studied Japan. And basically, that was our Asia specialty. And I have to say it was largely due to the vision of then Dean Louis Goodman, who's sitting in the front row here, who opened us up along with Ritsumeikan. So I carried with me, Professor Nakatsuji says the relationship is 25 years, it's actually 1991. I carried with me from Dean Goodman an agreement that was signed to have a dual degree program between Ritsumeikan and American University, and it's flourished since then. I have to say that at the time, I didn't really know where Japan was. I knew it was west of San Francisco. Some of you laugh, isn't it? It is west of San Francisco, and and not much more. And today we have a vibrant program. We have a chair in Korean studies. We have dual degree programs. We have engagement with students. We have faculty teaching in China and Japan and Korea. So it's really quite wonderful to see this audience here. This is not part of my 10 minutes. So let me say also that when I went to Japan in 1991, there was one of the most prominent people who studied or wrote about Japan in the United States was Joseph Nye, who was professor at Harvard University. And that year, he wrote an article calling for deep engagement in Asia by the United States. By deep engagement, he used a very famous phrase where he said, security is like oxygen. You don't miss it, you don't know you need it until you don't have it. And what provides security for Asia is the United States. That attitude, a patronizing attitude, I would say, has been a problem for the United States since we went to Japan in 1853 and went into Tokyo Harbor, when we went into the Philippines and took it over for the next, until 1946, made it a colony, although not during World War II, and has characterized our relationship with Vietnam and much of the rest of Asia. A patronizing attitude that is still prevalent in U.S.-Asian relations today and is something that I think we have to be concerned about for Asian countries. If there was any one message that I took away from the two talks we had, it's that. I would caution those of you who may not know more that the two talks you heard have a strong bias. It's a bias I also share, and that is that peace is better than war, and that the way to get to peace is by understanding the way another country thinks. And I want to finish up with that point. Let me start by noting that Professor Nakatsuji very helpfully highlighted one of the important elements of the U.S.-Japanese relationship that shapes the Japanese, what the Japanese can do. He said that Japan's role in the 1996 conflict was a problem of how Japan should cooperate with the United States in the framework of the Japan-U.S. Security Treaty. The Japan Constitution forbids Japan from entering into a collective security agreement. And both of those facts remain true today. That's true even though there's a new security agreement. Professor Ross previously had argued in a very thoughtful, unconventional article that President Obama's pivot to Asia was needlessly hostile and aggressive. I would note that I would say that the policy of the Asian pivot legitimates the kind of jingoism and anti-China sentiment that we find in the United States today, much the same way that President Truman forecast the McCarthyism of the late 1940s and early 1950s by creating a security apparatus that asked for people to sign loyalty oaths that led directly to Senator McCarthy's campaign. So President Obama, by having an Asian pivot, essentially legitimates the jingoism we have today. The national security strategy of the United States formally says that the goal of the United States, the first goal, is to respond to growing political, economic, information, and military competition from revisionist powers of Russia and China. One of my students, Elizabeth Wallermeyer, who is sitting in the audience, remarked in class the other day, quite correctly. She defined a revisionist power as one that wants to revise the power relationship in the region. We find this, the United States finds this to be a fundamental threat. But a threat to what? We are a power attempting to impose our will on relationships in the region, and other countries are trying to revise that power relationship. Of course, we would find it equally horrendous if someone came in and tried to revise our power relationship here, but we're the powerful country in the region, and we're claiming that they're acting in a way that's dangerous by trying to revise our dominance in the region. In today's newspaper, there's a kind of jingoism from the liberal Washington Post, where there's an op-ed that says China is racing ahead of the United States on blockchains. Be careful, they're ahead of us everywhere. They get ahead of us on blockchains, who knows what's next? You know, they're going to beat us out in yogurt and making better this and that. The China threat is vast in this country, and I think it begins with something like what President Obama did. So the current policy towards China is a policy like the policy during the Cold War of containment. And it's based on a fundamental misconception. So let me take a moment and read to you what Professor Ross wrote about this, which I think is really quite insightful. In a 2012 Foreign Affairs article, he said, Beijing's tough diplomacy stemmed not from confidence in its might. China's leaders have long understood that their country's military remains significantly inferior to that of the United States, but from a deep sense of insecurity, born of several nerve-wracking years of financial crisis and social unrest. Faced with these challenges and no longer able to count on easy support based on the country's economic growth, China's leaders moved to sustain their popular legitimacy by appeasing an increasingly nationalist public with symbolic gestures of force. Now, the United States official State Department website says that the U.S.-Japan alliance is the cornerstone of U.S. security interests in Asia and is fundamental to regional stability and prosperity. The U.S.-Japan alliance was strengthened in 2015, it adds, through the release of the revised U.S.-Japan defense guidelines, which provide for new and expanded forms of security cooperation. Japan provides bases, et cetera, et cetera. Notably, the guidelines themselves, if you go and look at them, reiterate that all actions and activities undertaken by the United States and Japan will be in accordance with their respective constitutions, laws, regulations, then in effect and basic positions on national security. This is the context for the Taiwan-China conflict today. Professor Ross and Professor Nakasuji make a good case that it is not in the rational interests of anyone to have a war. That's absolutely clear. The problem is that war is very rarely undertaken because of a rational calculation. I've studied the Cuban Missile Crisis very extensively, and I can tell you that no one wanted to go to war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It would have meant the end of the world as we know it. And yet we came very close to going to war. And we came very close to going to war didn't, as former Secretary of Defense McNamara said, by sheer luck. So what we have to do is increase our chances of luck. And I think that the way in which you do that is by engaging in empathy. Now, empathy is not sympathy. Sympathy means that you agree with the other side, you feel as the other side do. Empathy is different. Empathy means you put yourself in the other side's shoes and you see yourself as the other side sees you. That's something that Professor Ross has showed us how to do in several of his articles and in this recent book that Professor Levin mentioned. Empathy is an essential ingredient in getting us out of the tensions in East Asia. And what this means is that what the United States should be doing is encouraging both Taiwan and China to look for ways, and in this case Japan as well, to avoid provoking rather than exacerbating. We should be looking for ways of having Japan, for example, mediate, rather than exacerbate, mediate. The small countries, if there were a war between China and the United States, which would happen if there were a war between China and Taiwan, small countries are bound to lose. Japan, I would say, actually has the most to lose, given that it would suffer horrendous consequences. And what Japan has to figure out is how it can pursue its own interests apart from the United States. And I think its own interests are to be a leader in Asia. And to be a leader in Asia, it needs to figure out how to make this a peaceful outcome rather than an aggressive one. Thanks very much.
Great, and thank you for keeping time. Next, we'll hear from Sachio Nakato, who's also a professor at Ritsumeikan University.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Sachio Nakato, also a professor at Ritsumeikan University College of International Relations. Actually, I was a student at American University back in 93 to 94. At that time, Professor Goodman, for me, always Professor Goodman is Dean Goodman. He is one of the professors from American University decided to establish the so-called dual degrees program. And I was one of the dual degrees students, so I myself is a product of a cooperation between American University and also Ritsumeikan University. I'm very glad to be here to discuss about this topic at American University. Listening to Professor Brenner's comment, actually, if you look at international relations textbooks, Joseph Nye is portrayed as like a liberal scholar, of course, as everybody knows here. But maybe AU is more liberal than just common liberal scholars, I think. And if you have a similar seminar organized by, for example, Waseda University, one of the leading universities among USJI Institute, and CSIS, for example, maybe the content of discussion is completely different from what we are discussing right now, as you know. Having said that, but as you know, in the United States as well, and in Japan too, many people are talking about the rise of China, and more like negatively, many people concerned. And we are talking about what is the China's strategic intention. Maybe 10 years ago, we were just discussing, what is it? It's not really clear. Maybe 20 years ago, maybe. But right now, it seems like it's getting clear that China has strategic intention that is going to, maybe Professor Ross knows about this. I can make a comment or correct me. Someday in the future, replace the position of the United States. I don't know if it's true or not, but some people argue in that way. And my question is, if this is the case, is it possible for the United States to accept that situation? I'd like to have your comment on this. And it seems like only the United States and Japan are those countries who cannot accept the reality. Reality means China is just developing, and someday in the future it's going to take the position of the United States in the world #1. I participated in a conference in China a year and a half ago, Fudan University. That was about a conference on Japan and China relations. And keynote speaker was former ambassador to Japan. In that keynote speech, he mentioned that the fundamental problems between Japan and China right now is because Japan cannot accept current situation, which means China is already #1 in Asia and #2 in the world, but Japan cannot accept that situation. What the Prime Minister Abe administration is doing right now is to challenge or to prevent China from being #1 in Asia by using US-Japan Security Alliance. I was really, really surprised by that statement. But this is more like a common understanding in China. If you are familiar with Chinese issues, maybe it seems obvious, but for me, I was shocked, actually. That's how Chinese people think. Is it true? You may know this answer. I wrote an article, a comparative study, AIIB participation, comparative study on Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. These three countries, I say just three countries, including Taiwan, but anyway. These three countries depend on China on their own economy, but on security terms, these three countries depend on the United States. And then China, the United States actually asked the three countries not to participate in AIIB, or at least to be very cautious about participating in AIIB. Three countries responded pretty much differently. South Korea tried to be a member of AIIB. Taiwan applied, but rejected, because Taiwan is a part of China. Why you apply? You are part of China. Right? But Japan did not apply. Similar condition at international level, depending on China for economy, on security for the United States, but completely different situation, as Professor Ross mentioned in his speech presentation. South Korea it seems like adapting the reality, the rise of China. Taiwan and China relations very, very sensitive. But Japan does not accept it. And the United States, of course, no intention to join AIIB. Only Japan and the United States, they're just bringing up the issue. The governance issue is not very clear. And China is going to dominate AIIB. We cannot participate. So again, the same question. Are we ready? Are we, mean the United States and Japan, ready to accept China as, I don't know, hegemon, we might say, or #1, whatever the term you use. And second point we could argue is about U.S. commitment. Professor Ross mentioned a couple of times U.S. commitment to allies. So from Japan's perspective, the U.S. commitment is very important. The United States also knows about it. So every time North Korea conducted nuclear tests, President clearly mentioned that the United States is going to protect South Korea, Japan, allies. So the U.S. President at least know that those countries located in Asia are concerned about security issues from North Korea. Or maybe it could be China. But I just wonder if something happened, conflict happened between China and Japan over Senkaku, for example, in East Asia Sea. Does the United States really try to help Japan? Professor Nakatsuji mentioned this is more like a strategic ambiguity regarding the Taiwan Strait issue. If you clearly mention that the United States is going to protect you, then Taiwan might declare independence. It's not really, no one wanted because something happened. But in case of like Japan, for example, is the United States going to protect Japan if something happened? U.S.-Japan Security Alliance clearly mentioned that Senkaku area, U.S.-Japan Security Alliance is applicable to that area as well. But just I'd like to introduce one comment by our colleague. We have a professor at College of International Relations, Mitsumeki University, former vice, I'm not going to name him, but a former vice minister of foreign affairs Japan, which means he was a mainstream of Ministry of Foreign Affairs Japan. I asked the question to that professor, and he mentioned that he doesn't think that the United States is going to help Japan if Japan and China had conflict over Senkaku. I was also shocked too, because mainstream Japanese foreign ministry vice minister does not trust that the United States is going to protect Japan if that happens. I'd like to have a comment. Lastly, not much time, I think. Briefly. I skip. I stop here. Maybe more discussion is important. Thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you. So I'm very eager to get to questions because I'm excited about demonstrating how informed School of International Service students are. But I want to give Professor Nakatsuji and Professor Ross 2 minutes each if they want to very, very briefly respond to any of the comments from the discussants.
First, I want to thank you for your kind remarks and your comment of seeing others, I forget how you put it, but I would comment that Hans Morgenthau observed that one of the tenets of realism is to see yourself the way others see you, which is part of empathy. And so it's absolutely essential. One of the either benefits or weaknesses of writing and living outside of Washington is you ask different questions. So the Washington community asks, what do we do about the rise of China? If you're outside of Washington and you're an academic, you say, why are U.S.-China relations so bad? You say, why is China doing what it's doing? Whole different set of questions. And I approach the rise of China in a way that perhaps makes me somewhat PNG inside the Beltway, but I find what China's doing to be totally unsurprising and totally expected, and to be quite expected of any rising power. After all, American bases encircle China's coastal waters, from South Korea through Japan, into the Philippines, through Singapore, Changi, and frequent use of Port Klang in Malaysia. Unacceptable to a great power to have your coastal waters surrounded by a superior navy. And China said for many years, we don't like your Cold War alliances. It wasn't some ideological reason. Our Cold War alliances gave the United States bases to encircle China's coastal waters and its port facilities, and enable the United States to carry in close-in surveillance of Chinese ports and constant surveillance of Chinese naval exercises. Unacceptable. A rising power with new capabilities that wasn't at the table when the United States divided up the region is going to say, let's revise the region. I don't find that particularly surprising. That doesn't mean I have to like it, but there's a word we've sort of lost track of in Washington, and that's called a conflict of interest. They have their interests, we have our interests, and there's a conflict. It doesn't make them right or wrong. They have different interests, and difference in interest is a fundamental quality of international politics. And it's incumbent upon the United States to figure out how we deal with this conflict of interest in ways that minimize the risk to American security and simultaneously minimize the cost to the United States. Are we prepared to accept the rise of China? In some ways, we don't have much of a choice. If we can acknowledge the way the American Navy has acknowledged that we no longer have reliable allies in the Philippines, Singapore, South Korea, and Malaysia because their bases in cooperation at wartime is no longer certain, well, that's to say that China has sufficiently eroded American alliances in East Asia that we have a lot less power than we used to. And the trend is not good. The United States is doing by default, I was asked this the other day and it dawned on me, there's not much coordination in what I'm about to say, but by default we're doing three different elements of our foreign policy. From the State Department and the White House, we're giving bombastic speeches. This would be Vice President Pence, this would be Secretary of State Pompeo, and in the term of art in international politics, as we call this, cheap talk. The second element we have is the Navy is following up on that by doing freedom of navigation exercises at a highly frequent basis that the American Navy will tell you quite forthright, this is designed to establish American resolve. There is no threat to freedom of navigation. But with our declining capabilities and our allies being more worried, we're using naval activities to show that we're willing to stand up to China. Then the third thing we're doing is we're reaching out to India and Australia to establish greater defense cooperation with them because we need facilities that are far away from China. So the east coast of India looks really good when you don't have Subic Bay. Western Australia looks really good when you can't count on Singapore. And so we're sort of doing two things at once. We're resisting the rise of China by our freedom of navigation exercises, by our speeches, but we're also retreating to India and Australia simultaneously. Whether we can avoid, over time, I think we will have to adjust. As long as it's peaceful, and I think it's... No, the final point is, Americans are not accustomed, this is the adjustment process, to being number two. Since the end of the Cold War, we've been number one, we think it's our right to be number one. Right? So, the American Navy's used to being number one. We need to get used to the idea that you do not need to have superiority be number one in the South China Sea to be secure. And that's not something the Americans will come to terms with. The retreat to India and the Western Pacific suggests that we're moving in that direction. But to adjust to this, the United States will have to get used to the idea that American security doesn't depend on being number one in the South China Sea. That's different than Chinese hegemony.
Thank you.
That's two great powers, but they're number one.
Professor Nakatsuji?
Let me briefly talk about two things. I mostly discussed about mid-1990s. Mid-1990s were a very important moment in my understanding. Unfortunately, we lost chance. By that, what I mean that there was a possibility of multilateral security arrangement which integrated China. And, but as I have discussed in my presentation, that in the end, the United States and Japan opted for bilateral closer cooperation, strengthening military alliance. The answer is very simple. Multilateral security arrangement was still very much unpredictable, whether we will succeed or not. compared to that, the bilateral closer relationship was easy to construct. So easy option we had opted for. Well, why? Not, in my understanding, not necessarily China, but also, not necessarily China, but Kim Il-sung and Lee Teng-hui. Okay. Lee Teng-hui, I think I've talked a little bit already, right? So you understand, to what extent Lee Teng-hui was somewhat stimulating the existence. And what I'm telling is small powers sometimes change the situation, international relations. One more thing, strategic ambiguity. I emphasize closer coordination between Japan and the United States, which is maybe positive side. The negative side of double strategic ambiguity is no one has made decision, no decision at all. If that is the case, what will happen when real crisis had happened? Very close analogy is Korean War. Okay, before the Korean War, United States was not ready to intervene in Korean Peninsula, but almost instantly, Truman decided to intervene. Probably that was the right decision, but I'm not sure whether in future we can make right decision again. Okay. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you very much. So we have some time left over for questions, and lots of questions in the SIS tradition. I hope you'll approach the microphone. Please identify yourself, and please be succinct with your question. Thank you.
I'm Peter Humphrey, an intelligence analyst and a former diplomat.
I'm not sure the microphone is on. Someone coming to?
I challenge the notion that there's nothing you can do to stop the rise of China. In fact, it might be relatively easy, and all you have to do really is shred the great firewall of information and make sure the Chinese people know about the extent of corruption that's being conducted in their name. So I do challenge that. What I want to ask is, what's stopping China from, on Sunday afternoon of this week, grabbing the Senkakus, Kinmen, and Matsu, and knowing full well that the United States will not come to the defense of the appropriate parties in those small situations?
Thank you. Let's take one more question.
Thank you. My name is Jeannie Nguyen with Voice of Vietnamese Americans. I thank Dr. Ross for making clear that the China-Taiwan war is unlikely to happen, and it's not a unique question to ask about the conflict between China and Taiwan. And actually, we do have conflicts all over South China Sea, between China and Vietnam in particular. I would like to ask what Japan and US can do practically in ASEAN regarding the code of conduct and to sustain the international law, both in the South China Sea and in the trade zones, international trades, because coming down to it, that's where things are. Regarding Taiwan, I do think that Japan has a lot of capability to help with the trades and the information system, especially the AI. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's start with those two questions. Very brief answers. We could start with the information wall, or?
Well, as far as South China Sea, I'm not quite sure to what extent I can clearly discuss about what Japan and United States can do, but what I'd like to emphasize is in any part of history, I don't think China maintained its virtual control over those areas. What I'm telling is that now China is almost controlling the area. What I'm telling is, in their perception that they consider that they are protecting their sovereignty, at least in their conception. And I'm not talking, we are admitting that, okay? But in their conception that this area was historically China's. No, I'm not agreeing with China. I'm not agreeing with China, but that's their conception. And we have to start with that. We have to at least begin with history. How history, how we can construct, how we can reconstruct actual history of
Could you discuss the COC, the code of conduct that is at risk now with ASEAN?
Okay. We're still going through the panel, and we'll get to the next round of questions. You can see there's a long line of people behind you.
First, I think you underestimate the power of repression and fear. The Chinese Communist Party has increased repression quite significantly, and the people, like in any single-party authoritarian state with a party-controlled military, the people understand that they risk their lives in opposition. And the basis of opposition in countries around the world to such horrible governments is strong, and yet the single-party authoritarian states seem to last a long time. Second, I'd only add to that the Chinese people do not wake up in the morning and read the New York Times. They don't read English. The notion the world is flat is simply wrong. Tunisians don't wake up and read the Washington Post. Tunisia's flat. China's flat. But the spread of Western information throughout China is quite limited simply by language barriers. Why don't the Chinese take over the Senkaku Islands? Well, I think there are a number of reasons. One, the islands are worthless. Right? There's no oil near those islands, there's no gas near those, no. And fishes, no one goes to war over fish. Never have and never will. And so the value of the islands is relatively minimal. They're down to fish. Second, there are potential costs. Suppose they fought back. Well, you can risk fighting back for fish. And then third, you want the Americans to find the resolve to increase their defense budget? That might do it. And so the cost-benefit analysis just doesn't do it. On the South China Sea, Japan has its hands full in the East China Sea. So every time the Japanese Navy sends 2 or 3 ships down to Vietnam to do an exercise, they race back to the East China Sea because the Chinese are going to become more active in the East China Sea every time the Japanese Navy tries to cooperate with Vietnam. Well, one of the more amusing developments in the world is that the British Navy is sending their ships to the South China Sea when they're worried about the Russians. They're going right back to the North Sea real as fast as they can. So it's the United States or nobody, basically, in the South China Sea.
So we'll take 3 questions this time, and I want to make sure that we get questions from students because you are standing between them and spring break, and so that goes to show you how interested they are in this topic.
That's why they're mostly international students.
Thank you. Dong Huiyu with China Review News Agency of Hong Kong. And my question is for Bob and KG. For Bob, and the Taiwanese senior officials recently had a lot of rhetoric of possible war with mainland China. Do you think Taiwan really is facing the, the possible war with China? And secondly, for KG, and last week when the Taiwanese President Tsai Ing-wen interviewed with the Japanese media, she said that she hoped to have a official security dialogue with Japan, but the Japanese government seems to be, unwilling to have this kinds of talk. What's your view on that? Is it feasible? Thank you.
So next question.
Hi, I'm a junior student from SIS, and I have a question in regard to the contingency policy. So excited for spring break. So I would further address my question. The containment policy toward China, I was trying to add more So there are research showing that there's a positive proportional correlation between development of economy and level of democracy. So currently, we can spot pressure in China, where the more people are more educated, they're starting to want a say in politics. What I'm trying to say is, we can spot there are decentralization in economic sectors. I personally think that political decentralization is only a time issue. With the recent reverse, it might take longer time, but I personally think it's not impossible. And I was wondering, is the containment policy drove from the mentality, the us versus them mentality, is it more due to the loot-seeking factor or the security concerns? Because we can find examples like Japan. General MacArthur successfully show the people with his example with Japan. Why would that be impossible for this to happen with China? Thank you.
Okay, next question. Last one. We'll take a round of answers.
Right, no problem. Thank you. My name is Zetian Song. I'm a second-year graduate student from Comparative Regional Studies. Unlike them, the spring break is irrelevant because I have to stay here for work. My question is about domestic politics in Japan, specifically regarding the Constitution, Title IX. In 2012, the Japanese leading party, the LDP, did provide a constitutional revision that was highly controversial, did not pass. This is the first part. I'm wondering what's the panel's perceptions or idea in regards to that. Would that accelerate the constitutional revision trend or far-right trend, whatever? The second part is, in 2016, the Japanese government did push a statutory measure on military legislation, the Heiwa-Anze Hose. In that case, the Japanese cabinet does have a statutory power to provide collective self-defense, to exercise collective self-defense rights in regards to specific security concerns. So wonder how would the Japanese cabinet and its policy establishment can respond on that frame. Thank you very much.
So what is the level of tension across the Taiwan Strait? Number of quick points. Until the current president of Taiwan, Tsai Ing-wen, the Taiwan government said there is one China and Taiwan is part of China. They didn't say it was the People's Republic of China, but they said it was part of China. And on the ambiguity of who was China, they developed very good cross-strait economic and social relations and had political dialogues. The new government came in and said, we won't say that. So they had a deal. And so the mainland said, we had a deal. It's, you're going to retreat from our deal, we will retreat from our deal. Second, the mainland said, under your prior government, we can at least say we were moving in the right direction toward unification. It may take 40 or 50 years, but it's the right direction. Under this government, it started moving in the other direction. And so the mainland said, that's unacceptable. So they've been carrying out mild coercive diplomacy. Some military exercises, some saber rattling, requiring Chinese businesses to take a stand on independence, tougher speeches. And that all makes the people in Taiwan nervous, and that's their objective, is to make them nervous. So that's sort of the background. The second point is we are now in an election year in Taiwan. And in every country during an election year, we can call this a silly season. And it's a silly season in Taiwan, too. The president of Taiwan has a problem. She can't run on the economy because the economy hasn't done well. She can't run on social issues because her social policy has been rejected by the population. So she's running on that time-honored way that politicians run for office on the basis of nationalism. So she had a very tough speech on January 1st, before she even heard what Xi Jinping's speech was. She came out hard. She has said to Japan, let's have a security dialogue. She has said that she basically wants to be part of the containment of the Chinese security threat-seeking hegemony in Asia, so she's raising the stakes. Now, no one thinks she's going to declare independence, right? No. But on the other hand, it would be a lot to ask the mainland to just do nothing, because the mainland will behave like any other country and say, if we do nothing, that will simply encourage her. So they're going to have to find some way to respond that raises some tension a little more. And then in the United States, you have people who want to use Taiwan as an instrument to put pressure on the mainland. The era of Taiwan's friends driving policy is over. People in this government don't remember Taiwan as a friend. So they tend to see Taiwan in the same way you might see the Ukraine for U.S.-Russian relations. We're not going to win in the Ukraine, but we can cause trouble for the Russians in the Ukraine. That's all we're doing. And that's how people think, how can we cause instability in the Taiwan Strait or cause some trouble for the mainland, and we'll send these freedom of navigation operations through the Taiwan Strait, which the mainland may simply see as encouragement for Taiwan during an election year to become a little more frisky, a little more forward-leaning. So this is not a good year. Having said that, I'm not worried about war. This is not going to be war. As far as Taiwan mainland democracy, nothing's impossible. As I said, for a long time, not in my lifetime.
Nakatsuji, you want to say anything, Professor?
Well, let me start with possible security cooperation between Taiwan and Japan. Japan has been providing coastal guard boats to Southeast Asian countries. Japan can do that because coastal guard is police, not military. Okay, it is not against our constitution, so that's the limitation. Okay, another thing is collective self-defense. Collective self-defense became legal. It has been interpreted unconstitutional before, but from 1995, to 2015, LDP ruling party reinterpreted about collective self-defense. Collective self-defense, by that I mean Japan can possibly defend U.S. forces which was attacked by enemy if that action is vital for the security of Japan, for the security of Japanese territory. That means that collective self-defense is legal only for the security of Japan. Okay, so we cannot do the same thing about Southeast Asia or Taiwan. Okay, all Japan can possibly do is provide logistical support. Okay, Constitution, I'm not quite sure whether, but I guess my hunch is that the public opinion is still strongly loving Article 9. And even strong Prime Minister Abe cannot easily change the constitution. No one can be sure about the future, but I'm not that much pessimistic about that. About China thing, containment. Maybe we shouldn't use the word containment. Containment means no economic relations. Okay, United States and China had the huge economic relations. Okay, not entirely different from Cold War period between the Soviet Union and the United States. So we shouldn't use the word new Cold War easily. Okay, otherwise we will mislead ourselves and we will realize self-fulfilling prophecy, conflict between China and the United States. We should not give up. I agree to Bob that I'm not quite optimistic about China, future of China, especially ever since Xi Jinping. Okay, Prime Minister Kai-fu, after Tiananmen Square, tried to bring China from isolation, and Japan to some extent succeeded, but Xi Jinping quite different, too ambitious to me.
I So I think we should take the last round of questions. I'm seeing it increasingly less likely that we finish on time at 5 p.m. Can we have the next couple questions quickly?
Hi, my name is Cindy. I'm a freshman in SIS, and my question is specifically for Professor Ross. So you talked a lot about China's rise in the international system. So do you think if China did become a superpower or a leading power in the international system, it would still keep some parts of the liberal system, such as free trade, because it allows for economic expansion? Or do you think it would completely wipe it out and create its own rules? Thank you.
Hi, I'm a fourth-year undergrad, and I just want to say I think that peace would be great with no conflict. I think the position that war is not possible is great, but in light of Xi Jinping's stance on January, discussing that he would take Taiwan by force if necessary, military modernization, reprioritizing forces against Taiwan. Going back to the question of this forum, how would the U.S. and Japan respond to a conflict between China and Taiwan?
Hi, I'm Micah Spencer. I am a SIS junior student, and this is going to sound a little strong, but I hope we have the freedom to speak freely. The talk was very informative. Not sure if I agree with all of it, but it's good to hear different opinions. My question is particularly aimed at the two other American gentlemen. I'm not sure I'm completely convinced that the idea that if you have an increasingly powerful country where there's no freedom of speech, no freedom of religion, no political freedom, that the best thing for the democracies of the world to do is to just be like, well, let's just have no real security plan or no anything. If we're just nice, it'll just take care of itself. And also, I think someone commented that the U.S. didn't have any real way to deter Chinese aggression. Do you discount that even just the U.S. and Japan as well, even the submarine forces would not be a credible deterrent if you discounted the surface forces like the destroyers and the aircraft carriers, that the subsurface forces wouldn't be a very good deterrent? That was my two questions.
Hello, my name is Honor. Last question. So I believe it was Chairman Mao who said that he would be willing to wait 100 years for Taiwan. And then Clinton asked Chinese officials that again, and he said they'd be willing to wait 70 years. So it seems like the time is decreasing. My question is, how long is China really able to put up with this status quo? And is it possible that China might be the one to provoke this sort of conflict? We see them already building islands in the South China Sea. Might they try to do something similar? Thank you.
Okay, let's wrap it up.
All right, there's a lot there. First, just a quick comment on containment. Every status quo power is a containing power. You want to prevent the other country from expanding their influence where you are. We call that containment. But we don't want to use that term because it has a Cold War history to it, and that's not what we're doing. And you'll notice today that it's also politically incorrect, so people use the word, we want to balance China, right? But basically it's the same policy. But also, every rising power is a revisionist power. We don't like to use that word, it's a bad word. But every rising power wants to readjust the regional order to reflect so that it's commensurate with its new power. That's inevitable. We don't use those words, but I live in Boston, so I can use those words. I have a funny view of the liberal trade order. I don't think the Chinese are going to change their domestic economic system, their investment policies, their financial policies, their banking policies, their state-owned enterprise policies. They like them. And the Chinese Communist Party likes control, and they don't want to give up control. And these are the leverages they have over the economy. But in terms of barriers to trade, in terms of tariffs and everything else, China's a continental-sized economy. So free trade means that others will depend on their market, but they will never depend on any other country's single market. So they're naturally a free trader. I would expect they would have an interest in promoting free trade because they would, politically, it would reap to their benefit as well as economically. It wouldn't reap to other countries' political benefit if they become dependent. Look at Taiwan, 40% of the trade is exports are across the strait, so on and so forth. Politically, it's been detrimental to every country in East Asia, but it's beneficial to China. How do we respond to war? I guess I got to go back and play the podcast on the prior presentation. I sure hope human rights is not a driver of American policy. As far be it from me to see how a more militant policy toward China would make China more democratic. The dilemma America faces with regard to, let's take the human rights atrocities going on in Xinjiang, is that if we speak out and make this an issue in our foreign policy, it will do no good whatsoever and might actually do harm, insofar as the Chinese government would see interference as a reason to crack down further. But we have an interest in speaking out because we feel we have an ethical responsibility to do something. But if that ethical responsibility makes it worse, then is it more ethical to say nothing? This is not an easy, ethical, balanced way, but this is the way one has to sort of deal with this question. China has more submarines than we do, a lot more. And the rate of submarine production is going up faster than the United States' submarine production. And the nature of the East China Sea, the nature of the South China Sea the geography is significant in that there are choke points that make it difficult for U.S. submarines to get into the South China Sea. And the nature of the South China Sea is significant, so they probably need 1/3 less submarines than we do to have a balance in the South China Sea. Nuclear weapons, even submarine-launched ballistic missiles, are likely not as an adequate deterrent to use of force as they were during the Cold War. Xi Jinping says Taiwan is critical to the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, and he insists that we have rejuvenation 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, which is in 1949, which I think even he will be dead by then. So this is the time-honored American tradition of making a promise that can only be kept when someone else is the leader of the country. If I were a leader of China, the risk of going to war against Taiwan would far outweigh the benefits of going down in history as the person who liberated Taiwan.
Closing comments.
Yeah, I will touch upon only one thing. What the U.S. and Japan can possibly do for the defense of Taiwan. At least both countries should have a contingency plan. What to do with the crisis that happened. But I also have a very pessimistic view about U.S.-Japan cooperation. In both countries, I touched upon lack of domestic consensus in Japan, Socialist Party and LDP. Okay? We Japanese are not united or do not have one solid opinion. Japan is very divided. United States is divided too. President usually would like to have a strategic ambiguity, while Congress, especially Republican Party, would like to clearly defend Taiwan. So we have a political risk. Even if China started a war, what Japan, what United States can do has an unpredictable aspect. So that's the dangerous part.
Professor Brenner?
So, the United States military budget is almost 4 times as great as China's, even though they have more submarines than we do. If we want to think about threats to the United States, we have to be realistic about what kind of threat China is. Do they threaten the United States, or do they threaten U.S. imperial or hegemonic pretensions? And that is a question we have to ask ourselves. I would say that there is plenty of room to compete with China, and we're not doing it very well. China invests more in Latin America than the United States does, provides more aid in Latin America than the United States does. It has more influence in Latin America in some ways than the United States does. Climate change is probably the greatest threat we have, and it'll affect China more because it has more people, and it has 300 major cities that have insufficient water. Climate change is a very great concern for China. They're acting on it in more interesting ways than we are. We could take a lead in that. Rather than think about zero-sum challenges, which is a kind of realist way of thinking about the world, it's much better for us to think about positive sum, and I think we'd have a more peaceful world.
Great. That's a perfect way to end. It's definitely in the SAS spirit. Thanks so much, and thanks for the US-Japan Institute for collaborating with the School of International Service, and many thanks to my new friends and colleagues from Ritsumeikan University.